And now we get to talk about what is entirely missing in near-death testimonies. People who've been to the other side and come back have a lot to share with us. But what's interesting is if you actually listen to what they're talking about, there are certain things that are just entirely absent, that is not being mentioned at all. Things that you would expect to hear them say if what we are being taught in our religious circles is actually true. A lot of times the earth and people who live down here have generated a lot of religious teachings and beliefs and practices, thinking that they're going to be right, that they're going to be good, that they're going to be good enough for heaven, that they're going to be saved now. And then when you go listen to these near-death experiencers and you realize nobody up there cares about these issues, that they're not mentioned, that they're not asking, it doesn't seem to affect what type of near-death experience you have or how your experience up there plays out. And when we listen to these near-death experiences, these people have very long, drawn-out stories. Many of them, when they came back into their body after visiting the other side, they weren't just like in their body and that was it. They actually are in two places at once. Many of them described that pretty much for the first week after they got hospitalized, they are in and out of their body. And the whole time they are actually talking to their spirit guides or the people they met up there, or even God is showing up in the room, and they're being comforted by him. They're being given directions for, their future, and they're having conversations with him, and they're asking him questions. And so these are not just like one small little experience. These are long, drawn-out experiences where they have lots of data for us to hear and to understand. And when you compile them all together, literally thousands of near-death experiences have posted their videos online, many of which I have watched, if not as many as I could get my hands on. I've tried to watch them all. Anything that's a video that's been posted on YouTube that has to do with near-death experiences, I've tried to watch it. And what you discover when you listen to them is there's several themes that are just not being talked about. Nobody is addressing it. And I would have imagined that if the importance we place on these topics down here in our religious circles was correct, and it was really an important thing, then we would see it reflected in their testimonies. But what you end up realizing is their testimonies are focused on something a lot different than what you might imagine. So that's what this video is about. Learning what the missing themes are in near-death testimonies. Okay, so let's get started. One of the biggest ones, I mentioned this earlier, is that people who have died and gone into the next life oftentimes have a life review. And not all of them, I think it's like 70%, get to see their whole life from beginning to end, and they oftentimes have a being on their left or a being on their right or several beings around them that are processing this life review with them and helping them see their life. And at the end of the life review, they're asked a question, and the question has to do with how well did you love? What do you think? Was that loving? Could you have done better? How loving were you to this person, or were you hurtful to that person? And the focus is on what did you do that affected other people's lives. Some people say that they were able to see everybody whose life they ever touched, ever interacted with, ever had any contact with. They were able to see their life through that person's eyes. And so that's what the focus is on the life review, which is the judgment, in my opinion. There is no other judgment. The life review is the judgment, and it can be very intense. Some people come back from it very shaken, but you get to see your life in 3D, reliving it from the perspective of yourself and those people whom you interacted with. And also from God's perspective, or the beings on your left and your right. You get to see it from their perspective too. And they do not ask you at all or show any interest in what do you believe. What church did you go to? Did you belong to the right religion? Did you believe in Jesus? How did you believe you would be saved? What did you believe about God? Did you even believe in God? And so that's very glaring. It's like they have no interest in your belief systems. They have great interest in your practices. That's sort of I've heard of the contrast between orthodoxy and versus orthopraxy. Orthodoxy meaning meaning believing the right things, having a true belief system, having a straight, literally straight teaching. And everybody, particularly in the Western church, gets very concerned about having all the right teachings. Be thinking that somehow that will save them, thinking that somehow if they believe all the right things, that will get them into heaven. That's what God wants, is that they know and believe and understand the right things. But when you watch the near-death videos, you realize that nobody up there cares what you believed. They only care what you did. They care about your deeds, your orthopraxy. Was your practice of whatever you believed true? Was it good? Was it able to help others? Was it loving? And so you end up with a huge contrast between what we think is important down here and what the near-death experiences tell us really does matter when we are getting our life review. There's a great story on YouTube of one of a woman had died and she went up into the afterlife and she found herself in a room. And the room had some sort of instruction theme to it. And there were a lot of people standing in this room that she knew were dead like her and that were getting some lessons. But there were some large beings on the outside of the room. And so she ran up to one of the largest beings that she could find, somebody that she thought looked like he knew what he was talking about. And she ran up to him and with great anxiety said, "Tell me, did I have the right religion? Was Christianity right? Am I going to be okay?" And the being of light, she said, was listening to her. And what's interesting is people communicate in the afterlife using kind of like a universal language. And as soon as she was speaking these words to this being that was standing in the corner of the room, it said it was emotionally, empathically connected to her. And she said she could feel the emotions inside that being. And as the words were being formed in her thoughts and coming out of her mouth, her awareness was what he heard and what the being heard. And it was as though she had said, tell me, is the moon made of cheese?" And it was laughing. The being was smiling at her like, "I don't know how I'm going to answer you. That question has all these assumptions in it that don't make sense. And, I can't tell you if the moon is made of cheese. Let's begin with something else." And that was, there's a lot of stories like this where people, go up there with their fears of, did I have it right? Am I going to be safe? Did I believe the right things? And up there, they're like, "We're going to ask you a different question. Okay, we're going to reframe this." So I'm trying to put this in a video so you guys would start thinking like this now rather than being surprised when you get up there. Another question that comes up is, am I saved? What did I do did I have the right concept of salvation? And when you look at the experiences that these people describe from thousands of different angles, there is no demarcation between, these people over here are saved, these people over here are not saved. It's a continuum, folks. There is no line where people can be grouped into saved and not saved. The continuum does exist from dark, very dark, hellish places to light, bright, and holier places that are closer to the being of light, the big being of light. And there is a determinant, and that is whether or not you want to be in the light. Some people don't like the light, and they don't want to go to the light, and they stay away from the light, so they end up in darker places. That doesn't mean that they are in hell or the darkest places, and they're just kind of like, they pick the level of light that they can handle, and that's where they live, and they live with people that love the same things in that area. So you don't really end up with a clear demarcation. There are people that want the light and there are people that don't want the light. That's sort of more if you were going to label people, that would be the label to use. There is also no one gets sent anywhere. We have language and narratives in our culture that say, you're going to be sent to hell and you're going to be assigned to the place of the sinners and you're going to be thrown in a horrible place and be punished. Folks, that does not happen. There is no one sending anyone anywhere. You send yourself wherever you wish to go. There is no assignment that's given to you. You're not told where to go. So that's just missing. And so you have to change your mind if you're going to believe these near-death experience testimonies. There is no requirement for punishment. There is no sense that God is disappointed in you and therefore must make you pay a price for your sins. That language is entirely absent. The people who meet the being of light report that they felt his utter delight in them. And they describe it as a parent who has joy meeting their child. That God loves seeing his precious child and accepts them entirely. And he is not, angry. He's not boiling the fires of hell just for them. That language is entirely absent in near-death experiences. There isn't hellish imagery like the infernal kind, where you see boiling lakes of fire and a great, cosmic cooker that God has inflamed with his wrath. That's just not there. You can see hellish, kind of like peripheral vision, like smells that are kind of ugly and damp and dark, and sulfur people can smell burning, something like burnt sulfur. People describe dark places, but it's very much like an abandoned building in an old rundown part of town that nobody's put any effort into keeping up, and just wandering souls just kind of congregate there who don't really have any place better to go. And, a place where you might find, the drug dealers and the gangs and, some literally ugly people. They can hang out in these places. They're described as being ugly visually, but there isn't a government over that building. There isn't a somebody poking you with a pitchfork. All that is just not there. There are lots of departed spirits, though, that live in dark places, and we could say that those are hellish communities. But there is no hellfire, there is no lake of fire where the wicked burn and are tormented by an outside force. That's what I want you to hear, is that there is no outside, person acting upon them. If they're in torment, it's something that they live in and wish to live in and seem to stay in and don't want to escape. At any time, they can look up, have a thought that's enlightened and a wish to go to a better place, and they will instantly be transported there. They are not being forced into those darker places. They can hang out there if they wish, but it's their choice. And let me show you a passage that actually teaches that, and most people miss it, and it's kind of like obvious, but the Revelations 22, it says in verse 11, and listen to the freedom that's allowed. This is after, God has done, what Christians would call the Great White Throne Judgment, and people have been, given their future. Here it says, very strangely, let those who do wrong still do their wrong. This is the last chapter in the Bible, folks. And let the one who is filthy still be filthy. Do you hear the freedom being given to them? And let the one who is righteous practice his righteousness. And let the one who is holy still keep himself holy. And so it's this continuation of what they want and where they want to be. It's not anyone forcing it upon them. And later on, it describes, 2 verses later, in verse 15, it says, it said, blessed are those who wash their robes, so that they may have the right to the tree of life and may enter by the gates into the city. And this city is considered the heavenly city. And it says in an earlier verse that its gates will never be shut, that these gates to the city will always be open, and it encourages people who are outside to come in just by washing their robes, and that they would have the right to the tree of life, and they could enter in by the gates into the city. So it says, come on in, you're invited. but it continues to describe outside there are still dogs and the sorcerers and the immoral persons and the murderers and the idolaters and everyone who loves and practices lying. What's interesting is that's exactly what we see in these afterlife testimonies. There are places where people congregate around certain things that they love, and if they love and practice lying, they're going to be with the liars. If they love murdering, they'll be with people who love to kill. If they want to be around people who sorcerers like to have power over each other, they will be around a bunch of people that like to have power over each other. And they're not described as being afflicted with that from the outside. It's just where they want to be. That's their love. That's their hellish community. Okay, continuing. There is no Satan and there is no God who's causing torment to these people. A lot of times people are afraid of like, well, I'm going to be either in the kingdom of heaven or the kingdom of hell. And hell's got this hierarchy, and there's this Satan being on top, and there's this government, and it's gonna inflict pain on me. And it's like, no, that doesn't happen. There's just a world of spirits that are pretty much like you, if you're in a dark place, and you don't really answer to them. You can leave them at any time, or you can engage them at any time. But there is no great demon, exalted, cosmic force that's powerful over the hellish communities. There just are hellish communities, and that's it. So I just want to encourage you. Some people have asked me, what about Satan? You don't have to be afraid that there's this great Satan that's going to like have power over you. And you don't have to be afraid of being cursed by him. Some people have been tricked or felt like they've been tricked into having written a contract with him. And there is nobody on the other side that's enforcing that contract or who you owe that agreement to. They just don't have that language in the afterlife testimonies. If you did make a contract with the enemy or the devil, it's something you made inside yourself because it made sense for your own life. And it may give you an imaginary person to fulfill a particular role that you can now blame or someone you can follow. We'll get to this later in this series, but just know that a lot of this is your own projections, folks, and we need to take ownership of what we believe and hold on to, because those are the things that become our limitations. Those are the things that become our hindrances before we can grow. Okay, so I really don't see Satan showing up in near-death experiences. People who talk about Satan are people who are inventing him in a falsified NDE. A lot of people try and make up stuff thinking that they believe that they want to be popular on YouTube, and so they post YouTube videos thinking they're going to be like stars, and the reality is that most of them that talk about having met Satan and had a conversation with him, that is their own imagination, folks. It is not a true near-death experience. True near-death experiencers didn't see Satan. There was no Satan that showed up. He just wasn't there, folks. He's just not there in the afterlife. If you hear a video that say he was there, that is highly suspect that that video was false. So you're not going to find powerful demons or powerful angels that are now fallen. You don't see that. But you do see lots and lots of people, hordes of people that really do hate God and hate the light. And they don't collectively follow a head master. And there's no extra power that they have. They're just your run-of-the-mill wandering spirit that's kind of lost, that likes to hang out in the dingy part of town, and that's where they live. That's their camp, if you will. And at any point they can leave if they wish, but there's nothing making them stay there. No person that's forcing them to stay there. Okay, I think I made that clear. You also you don't see a cosmic struggle between evil and good, and that somehow God has this God that's fighting him. Really, there's only one guy, the being of light, in charge, and light flows from him, and it goes down a continuum, and people can live in a very dark place far away from him. But there's nothing over there that's like the equivalent of him. It's like there's God in heavenly places, and there are hellish places where people hate the love, and they hate being loved. And there's a lot of things there that characterize hell. particularly the absence of what is good and what is true. But they do not have any, great power over them. It's not like this yin and yang thing. There's basically the light and its truth and love that emanates from it, and then there's people over here that don't want it. The absence of those things. Okay, continuing, there's really no guilt or judgment. You don't see people walking around feeling judged or feeling like they've been given a prison sentence. You don't see people who are walking around feeling guilty or feeling, like they're rejected or that they've been, cast out. You don't really see that. People sort of know that they are where they want to be. There is shame and emotions of embarrassment, regret, and remorse. Those emotions do show up during the life review and after the life review. So those emotions are in spades. A lot of people have those or report having those. But nobody is on the outside judging you, and there's nobody walking around feeling bad or guilty or sentenced or condemned. We just don't see it. There is no vengeful God who is out to hurt his enemies. There is no angry, vindictive God who's going to avenge the wrong that you've done and pour out wrath on you. Just not seen, folks. It doesn't exist. That is purely a man-made invention. We do not see it in the afterlife. There is light, and there is the being of light, and that light carries qualities of purification and testing our works and burning up things that are false and purifying and calling us and attracting us to greater good and greater wisdom and greater love. So the light accomplishes hellfire, if you will. And in my opinion, the same being of light that's shining this great light that permeates all of heaven and the hellish places, that light could be the same light that tests, to use biblical terminology, believers and unbelievers, and it reveals their works and it shows what was good about what they did. It doesn't inflict pain, but it does cause people not to want to be around it, and they can choose to be far away from it. Okay, you don't need to be afraid of or fear God. A lot of times in these near-death experiences, you realize that God is so loving, so unconditionally good and kind and happy to see you that all of your fears of meeting him melt away, and really what you're left with is a beautiful experience of falling in love with the being of light. The fears that we see taught down here on this earthly plane about God, I think are just us projecting onto him a fear of what he could be like, or that he's mad at us, or that he's some angry parent. That is not the case. He isn't one of those things. That's a man-made projection onto God. You've heard the line that God created man in his own image, and then after man lived on the earth for a while, he invented religion and then returned the favor. Man created God in his own image. And that's the problem, is we have a complete misunderstanding of who God is. A lot of it is our fears projected onto God. I don't think it is what we see in the afterlife at all. Also, Jesus does show up. We do see a lot of Jesus sightings. A good number of people, whether they believe in Jesus before they get to the afterlife, or they didn't believe in him or didn't even know who he was, will meet him. And they will instantly know who he is, and they'll instantly be very curious about him if they don't know much about him. So Jesus does show up a lot, and he seems to be the one that shows up if you really want to talk to God. But God doesn't necessarily reveal himself as Jesus. There are a lot of times when he shows up as a culturally embedded figure that makes sense to the person who's having the near-death experience. There are people who do meet other beings. I think they're actually meeting God who's choosing to reveal himself in a form that makes sense to the experiencer, especially if they're from a culture or are asking questions that would make the most sense if somebody that they're familiar with shows up and answers those questions for them. And it's just like Google Translate would work. If you ever try and translate a phrase from one language to another language in Google Translate, oftentimes Google is just picking the best word in your language set that matches the intent of the communication. So that's what God is doing. Using universal translation, he is expressing himself in a language that makes the most sense to the person who's having the experience. And it's uniquely tailored to what they already understand and how they're already thinking. So just because somebody meets an exalted figure in their religion doesn't mean that exalted figure is any more valid than one of the other exalted figures. It's just that's how God chose to reveal himself to that person. So you have to think about this from the top down, not the bottom up. I think the mistake that we oftentimes make is we try and figure these things out with our small brains here, and we're not realizing that the way it works up there is God is trying to maximally communicate love and truth to us in ways that make the most sense to us, and he'll use whatever means necessary to do it to bring about the maximum impact on our growth and development as a soul. It has nothing to do with, oh, well, then that's who it is, or that's what it means, or that's who God is. It's like God transcends all that. He just wants to get the message through however the message can be delivered. There is no special punishment for suicides. Sometimes people are afraid that, if you are kill yourself, then you're going to end up being punished. And it's like, nope, not really. The manner of your suicide and the things that were going on that caused you to kill yourself may affect your experiences in the afterlife. They may not. Some people go straight to talk to the being of light and have a wonderful conversation with them. Other people may actually experience anger. Okay, so now I'm going to put a caveat here. There are some instances where a suicide does meet an angry God. And he's angry because he says to them in kind of a upset language, you didn't even begin to fulfill your purpose. You haven't even begun to live your life on the earth. You haven't even gotten started yet. It's very, he reminds them that they had a purpose on the earth, and that purpose hasn't even begun yet because they've been so intent on killing themselves. And God gets angry at them for not fulfilling their purpose, for not completing the reason for them having a life on the earth. And so he sends them back. There's a couple of near-death testimonies from people who have actually tried to kill themselves more than once. And the second time they meet God, he's even more upset with them and says, look, you haven't taken your life seriously, and you really haven't even begun to discover the reason for why you have a life. So now I'm going to send you back and try and do it better this time. They don't even try and kill themselves again because they realize he's not ready to take them, and they have work to do down here. And so I find that interesting that we have these reports from people that have actually talked to God and were able to sense his fervency and how important it is for them to actually be here and to complete a mission. We'll do a whole video in the future on finding your purpose and what that would look like. Last comment I wanted to make is there does seem to be after-death communication. These are people that have died and gone on to the world of spirits, and they've stayed there, but they do seem to be able to communicate with people here. In good and bad ways, depending on what's their intent or what kind of spirit they are. These souls are oftentimes responsible for the paranormal reports or accounts that you may have heard. I don't really believe that these are demons that are showing up, but they do seem to be people like you and me who've died, gone into the afterlife, and that they, for whatever reason, sought to still stay connected here. And so we do have the influence in this plane, this earth plane, of the hellish communities as well as the heavenly communities. And those hellish communities are not overseen by a great power, but seem to be just the influence, the rabble, the hordes, the masses, of people that did not want to be in the light. And they do seem to be able to exert some sort of influence, only if you are open to it. there's a story of, actually this happens quite often, where people are going up the tunnel of light and they actually look down around them on the sides of the tunnel and they see people in the dark places. They see people in the grungier parts of the afterworld. And these people are sometimes yelling at them or trying to entice them to come talk to them. And there was one person who actually stopped and wanted to like help the person, and one of the angels that was helping their transition into the next life said, no, don't talk to them. Keep going towards the light. So there are people there that do, I think, kind of like become responsible for the phenomenon of demons that people may have encountered in various things they've either read, or if you've been on the mission field or something and met somebody that was demonized. These do seem to be spirits that have passed on, very, very much other human-like people that can come back and have influence if you're open to that and if you give them permission for that. Schizophrenics might actually be hearing some of these voices. There's some evidence that people with certain types of schizophrenia are actually hearing the voices of, we might call them demons, but the near-death experiencing people would call them more like people that have passed on and come back and wanted to have an influence on the earth plane. There's also okay, I think that's enough of the body of evidence that I wanted to cover. And as you can see, it covers a lot, and there's a lot there to learn. And nothing I am saying here is actually, dogmatic. We're getting new evidence all the time, new data is coming in, but the data pretty much follows the same theme. And if you're watching this, I would challenge you to find me a legitimate YouTube video that contradicts what I've outlined in this last talk about what is absolutely clearly missing in the near-death testimonies. Absolutely missing. It's silent. They do not even talk about it. I find the silence very informative because it helps me know what's important and what's kind of superfluous. It's not even something to be considered. It also highlights what verses mean, and it explains certain verses like, oh wow, that's what that verse means. That's really clear. And then it shows that other verses we may have interpreted completely wrong and maybe putting the wrong emphasis on it and really taking it out of context. So this study, I'm now going to go into 4 more videos after this one, and the next 4 topics are going to be how do we determine what is true? What is it that actually makes something true? Is it because it's given by a law, or is it because it's there to actually help people and that's what makes it true? So thoughts around what is truth, because that falls out of these near-death experience testimonies as kind of glaringly different than how we would think about truth. Another question would be, how do punishment and consequences work? Yes, there are lots of consequences for every choice you make, but is it really going to be punished in the afterlife the way we've understood it? Or is that merely our understanding of it from like with maybe our own human parents? And then third is, what can we tell about God's emotions? What's interesting is, up there, you are empathically connected to the person who's talking to you. Not just hearing their words or understanding the content, but you feel everything they're feeling while they're communicating to you. So that gives us a big insight into God's emotions, and I find that very interesting. And then the fourth one is, what does salvation mean? Everybody is worried about what happens if you die and you're not saved, or what happens about aborted babies that go into the afterlife and they never heard about Christ, or they never had a chance to get saved. And what you end up discovering is salvation is not even discussed in these near-death experiences. Well, what is it then? What does it mean to be saved when the Bible talks about that? So I thought those were really interesting. There's a lot of implications there. And one thing that really does, you can come away from these near-death experiences with is all of the fear that people have about God and punishment and condemning people and cursing people and sending them to hell, and it just doesn't make sense. It's not legitimate way of speaking about things if you accept the near-death testimonies as valid. I personally have been very benefited by this study, and it's changed my thinking on a lot of different topics, specifically when it comes to salvation. Why did Jesus have to die? What was the meaning of the cross, and then just realizing that it matters a whole lot more how you treat people than what you think is true. That's just what comes out of this study. So thank you for being a part of this video. I know it was a long one, but nobody have I heard yet cover the topic of what is missing in near-death experiences. So I thought it was good to just put it in a list. Okay, thank you for being a part of this adventure with me, and I look forward to meeting you in the next 4 videos. Bye.